Hey, keep your Bibles open there to John chapter 18, and we're going to look further at that this morning. And I want to begin by asking, firstly, it might seem like a strange question, but it might make sense in a little bit. What do the films Love Actually and Pulp Fiction have in common? It might sound like really polar opposite kinds of films, or you might just think, I've never heard of either of them. Hopefully you've heard of at least one of them. Although one is the sort of nice kind of feel-good romantic comedy. The other is kind of a Tarantino film, with all the kind of things that come with a Tarantino film. What they both have in common is that there is a multi-plot line to it. There's multiple characters, and especially Pulp Fiction, the film isn't linear. You follow the different stories of the different characters, and you come in and out of those different things. It's quite creative and innovative. Why is that relevant? Well, John's account here of Jesus' arrest is put in a really creative and not necessarily a linear way. In fact, actually, John is using this kind of method far before it's become a thing in films, where John is coming in and out of several different plot lines that kind of help pull this narrative together. And there's three main plot lines that John is tracing through his account of the narrative of Jesus' arrest, and they help to make sense of the way in which he's ordered it. The three plot lines are that there's a miscarriage of justice, that Jesus is being not treated justly or rightly. He's feeling the force of the law upon him illegitimately. There's a miscarriage of justice. Secondly, there's the plot line of the denial of a friend, the denial of Peter. And then thirdly, there's the plot line of Jesus in the midst of the trials where he is supposedly being, put under questioning of, defending himself, where actually Jesus is turning the questioning around upon his interrogators, and he's speaking truth to power. Those three different plot lines help to understand the way in which John is putting together this narrative account and what he's trying to show us, what he's trying to achieve here. Firstly, we see in this account that there's a miscarriage of justice. We see that in that first section, verses 1 to 14. But we also see that plot line picked up in verses 28 to 32 as well, where we're coming back to that idea. But John wants to emphasize here that although justice is not being done here, that actually people are flouting the law as they're arresting him and imprisoning him and questioning him and ultimately consigning him to death, but that Jesus is actually in control of the situation whilst confronting the powers of the world. Verses 2 and 3 here, we hear of the arrest. Jesus leads the disciples from Gethsemane through the Kidron Valley, and this is just on the sort of outskirts of Jerusalem here. And Jesus is leading them to a familiar place. We know this because it says that Judas kind of knew, he had a pretty good guess as to where Jesus would take the disciples. It's a place that's quieter, that's outside of the city. It's a way in which actually Jesus is protecting his disciples. That actually now it's coming to a quieter place here. He's protecting against there being any kind of a revolt or riot, Jesus being taken prisoner. We know that's one of the things that actually the religious leaders had feared anyway, was that if they captured Jesus in public, that it would cause a riot. That's why they seek for Judas to find a way to take him and arrest him when actually there isn't a crowd. And actually Jesus is quite willing to do that for the sake of not causing a riot and for protecting his disciples in the meantime of it. But we hear here, verses 2 and 3, that Judas procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they come to arrest Jesus with lanterns and torches and weapons. Here they come to arrest him as if he's some sort of thug. And the truth couldn't be further from it. He's no thug. He's no violent revolutionary here. Verse 4 tells us Jesus knowing what would happen. He's not fazed. He's not surprised. Albeit the law is being flouted, and He's being arrested here with weapons and torches and everything else, with a band of soldiers. Jesus isn't fazed. He's not surprised. He knows what's going to happen. But look next to the response here. Knowing what would happen, he came forward and he asked them, "Who do you seek?" They bring weapons, as if they're going to need them to overpower him. Without the weapons, they're not going to be able to overpower Jesus and his sort of attempts to resist arrest. And here is Jesus commandeering, taking command of the confrontation with just a word. Knowing what would happen, he steps forward and asks, "Who are you looking for?" He takes charge, takes control. He's not afraid at all. Jesus has earlier said in John's Gospel, "Nobody takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it back up." We see that actually Jesus is the one in charge here. He's not afraid. He's not scared. He's not resisting it. They bring weapons as if they're going to have to overpower him, but actually Jesus steps into it. He comes forward and asks, "Well, who are you looking for?" Knowing, but now giving them the chance to say, "Well, Jesus of Nazareth." We get this kind of strange response here from Jesus that they're asking for Jesus of Nazareth. That's who we're seeking. And 3 times we hear Jesus saying, "I am he." And on the one hand, that might just seem like that might be something that sort of passes us by. Just think, well, that's a slightly odd way of putting it, that's me. But he says it 3 times, and it's almost as if there's a hint, perhaps at least, that there's something more than Jesus just saying, "Yes, I'm Jesus of Nazareth," but in saying, "I am he," that there might be a suggestion of him saying, I'm the Lord. I'm God. There might be a suggestion of that. But 3 times Jesus is not running away from the charges. He's not running away from his captors, but actually saying, "Well, I'm him. Here I am." He's not running away in fear. He's walking into it and accepting this path before him. And it's a strange reaction, and some of the reason that I say that there's maybe a hint that Jesus is doing more than just saying, "Well, I'm Jesus," but he's saying, I'm God, is that look at the reaction of the soldiers here. Verse 6, it says they drew back and they fell to the ground. There's a surprise amongst them. There's an awe among them. Whether they understand what's going on, whether they understand who Jesus is or not, who knows? But there's this reaction among them of there is something different here about this man. And bear in mind, these are not soldiers who are easily scared. Look at their line of work. They're used to dealing with criminals. They're used to dealing with violent individuals. And their job involves a fair degree of violence. And yet here they are, awestruck by Jesus, just by his words. And John wants to show us something in that here are these seemingly, outwardly, physically powerful men who are awestruck when Jesus simply speaks. Jesus doesn't need a weapon to be powerful. He's able to overpower them and the situation with just his words. There's something completely different about him. It's something that's been said about him throughout the course of the Gospels, where the crowds have said, they're crowding around Jesus and saying of his teaching that, he's not like the Pharisees and the scribes, for he teaches with authority. Pharisees and the scribes tried to teach with authority in terms of, you better do what we say because we're in charge and we can make life hard for you if you don't do what we say. Jesus has an authority just simply in what he says, that it's the truth. It's God speaking. And he takes command of the situation here. The soldiers were meant to intimidate Jesus and to stop any hint of him maybe even thinking of a violent resistance. But their power is simply an illusion. And Jesus is seen to have true power just in his words. And then we have this kind of famous, yet another mistake from Peter. verses 10 and 11 here. Then Simon Peter takes out his sword and strikes one of the men there. And we see in Peter that he's just simply not got it yet. Look at the poise and the calmness and the control of Jesus. And here is Peter completely not understanding that. Here he is drawing the weapon, thinking he's going to fight off this band of men and stop this path, despite Jesus having said so many times that this is what he will do. It's a repeat of the transfiguration. Jesus is transfigured. They see him in his fullness of his glory for a moment. And it's amazing. And Peter has this amazing moment of confession that, you are the Messiah, you are the Christ, the Son of God. And straight away after has this complete low light of where it's like, well, Jesus says, well, look, now I'm going off to Jerusalem. Now I'm going to be taken, imprisoned. I'm going to be put to death on a cross. And Peter's response is, well, no, far be it. Well, no. And so Jesus will say, no, get behind me, Satan. No, the plan and the purpose of the Father is that I go through with this. And Peter's not understood it at that point. But we get an insight here that he still hasn't understood it. That at the moment that he's being arrested, he's still trying to resist it. What Jesus has already said to them a number of times, no, this is what I'm called to, this is what I must do, and this is what I want to do. He's not got it. He's not got that Jesus is in control, firstly. He's not out of control. He doesn't need help in this moment. He's in control. Peter doesn't get that Jesus is following God's plan. This is what's been set before him, and he's meeting it. And thirdly, he thinks that he can save him. Somehow in his head, there's this thought that somehow he would be able to help him against all these masses. Somehow just Peter would actually have the ability to save him. And he doesn't. And so Jesus responds to him again here, verse 11, shall I not drink from the cup my Father has given me? The Father is in control here, not the authorities, not the soldiers. This is the Father's plan, and he's resolved to do it, and he will. We read in Mark chapter 14, verses 32 to 42, Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. John gives us a slightly different account because he gives us this high priestly prayer in John 17 of Jesus praying for his people. And John wants to make that point of here, even in this moment, Jesus is so concerned for his people, for his disciples, going forward, that God continue to keep them and hold them and protect them going forwards. But we hear in the other gospel writers the other aspect of Jesus' prayer that night, which is that he's, battling with the reality of what it is that he's going to face before him, and says, well, Father, if it's possible for you to take this cup from me, please would you? But then resolves at the end, but not my will be done, but yours. Resolves that he will do it, but there's a recognition of the difficulty, the pain, the stress, the anxiety, the fear of it, but he doesn't give in to it. He resolves at the end of it to do the Father's will. He's resolved to do that. Shall I not drink of the cup my Father's given to me? And then this plot line of the sort of miscarriage of justice is returned to later on in the passage. John flits in and out to dealing with the denial of Peter and Jesus speaking truth to power before Caiaphas. And then we'll come back now again to think again about the miscarriage of justice going on here in verses 28 to 32. The religious leaders now bring Jesus before Pilate, and we see the way in which justice is being miscarried here. Pilate says to them, verse 29, what accusation do you bring? John wants us to know here, wants to be clear, that Pilate cannot see what it is Jesus has done wrong, so that he has to actually just come out and ask him, well, what is it that he's actually done that's so bad? The response of the religious leaders is not actually to give an accusation, because there isn't one. And it's significant that that's the case, and that's recorded. And John wants to make a point, even of these little things like this, that it's clear that there is no accusation. He has done no wrong. They simply respond here, if he wasn't doing evil, we wouldn't have delivered him. Trust us. Stop asking questions you may not like the answers to. Just trust us that he has, and please, will you do as we ask? There is no genuine accusation. There's no genuine wrongdoing on Jesus' part. And Pilate senses this. And so verse 31, it says, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. He realizes that this is an internal thing to do with your religious rituals and rules. This is something for you to sort out. This is not something for me to get involved with here. He knows it's a sham. He can see through it. He doesn't see the crime. Verse 31, he continues, religious leaders continue here. It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. And again, John's eager for us to see here that they've already come to a verdict and they've already come to a decision on the punishment without a trial. It's a complete sham. It's a complete show trial. They've already cast the verdict and they've already cast the sentence. They want him to die. They want him to die by crucifixion. That they can't enact themselves might make them, unclean before God. And so verse 32, we get that hint. And this is something that Jesus had already been pointing to a number of times. John has pointed this out through his gospel, that Jesus has come in order to die. In chapter 3, 14 to 15, it says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, this is Jesus speaking, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. In chapter 8, 21, he says, I'm going away and you'll seek me and you will die in your sin. In verse 28, he says, when you've lifted up the Son of Man, then you'll know that I am he. Chapter 10, verse 11, I'm the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. In verse 18, he says, no one takes his life from him, but I lay it down of my own accord. In chapter 12, 32, he says, when I'm lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. And in chapter 16, 28, he says, I came from the Father and have come into the world, and now I'm leaving the world and going to the Father. He's both been very obvious and very overt about the fact that he's come into the world and he's going to die. And he's also been very clear about saying how he's going to die. The way that he speaks of it in John's Gospel is about being lifted up on a cross. So he's been clear about this, that this was always going to be what was going to happen. And John gives us a little sort of footnote there just to show that, all of this showed that everything Jesus had been pointing to is exactly what happened. Jesus feels the weight of the law upon him in a complete miscarriage of justice in order to set you and I free from the weight and the burden of the law. The second plot line is the denial of Peter. And one of the things to note right from the very beginning is that this would not be included unless this was true. If the sort of common misconception and myth that goes around is that, Jesus did die, but he didn't rise again, he was a good man, perhaps he even had some powers to perform some miracles, and certainly seemed to be a very good orator and seemed to care about people. But he wasn't God. His friends created this myth in the aftermath, and they created something that kind of highly benefited them because it created this religion and they made money from it. If that were true, which it's not, one of the things you would not do is include details like this. If really this Christianity is a conspiracy of people that knew that Jesus didn't rise again, but they're just saying it anyway, because that was what they hoped and expected, and they were so disappointed if that's not the truth. You would not include the detail that you didn't believe it up to that point, that actually Peter here had denied Jesus. You would make yourself look good. You would airbrush it. So, one of the ways in which we know we can trust the gospel accounts is that they include details that, quite frankly, if you and I were relating to try to convince people of something we knew wasn't true, we wouldn't have these incriminating bits in it that show us not believing it and not trusting him and not having faith in him. One of his closest friends has already betrayed him out and sold him out to the authorities, and another here is denying that he's ever known him. So Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple, following along at a distance. And there's a sense in which they just want to see what's going to happen. There's that thing that happens that, you see an accident on the road and you can't help but look across just to see. And there's a sense in which a couple of the disciples are following along to see now what's going to happen. It says Peter stood outside the door, and it's less about Peter being afraid here, so he just stands at a further distance than the other disciple. It's more just the fact that the other disciple seems to be recognised and is let in and has to kind of vouch for Peter. It's more that, Peter's maybe struggling to get past the bouncer who doesn't know who he is. And so the other disciple speaks and vouches for them, and he can come in. There's questions about sort of who this other disciple is. It may well be John. May well be that John, the writer in this gospel here, has come from a kind of priestly family and have those kind of connections. Yeah, as possible. The other possibility is it could be someone like Joseph of Arimathea, who we know has ways and means. We know he had the ability to actually go to Pilate in order to get Jesus' body after his death and to bury him. We know he gives him a tomb, so he has some amount of money there. Could also be someone like Nicodemus, who we know is very high up in the Jewish sort of hierarchy. And although his faith sort of towards the beginning in John chapter 3, is quite kind of secretive. He's trying to keep that secret from others in case he gets kicked out of the synagogue. Actually, later on towards the gospel, he starts speaking up a little bit more. We don't know ultimately, but we know if it's one of those three, which it likely is one of those, that it's a source that we can trust. We know that it would be someone who was actually close around Jesus and the disciples in the aftermath of Jesus' death and resurrection. So Peter, with another disciple here, is watching on to see what will happen. And he's asked this question, and he's given the chance here. Notice the way the question is asked. It's asked in the negative. So really, it's giving him the easy out, because they ask him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? And there's a poisoned chalice for Peter here. Does he reject his friend? Or does he risk his life? And he's left with an unenviable question for himself. Will he sell out a friend? Or will he risk his life in saying, yes, he was one of his disciples? And so Peter says, I am not. And and this is one of the things that John wants to highlight to us here, you remember Jesus saying 3 times, I am he. And 3 times now Peter will say, I'm not. And the two are going to be paralleled and contrasted. That Jesus is 3 times going to say, yes, I'm him, and not run from suffering, but walk into it for the sake of his friends. Peter is 3 times going to say, I am not, and pull back from suffering with the consequence of his friend suffering. These 2 things are going to be paralleled. The faithfulness of Christ and the faithlessness of Peter. It's a sad contrast. But here is Jesus, the good shepherd, who doesn't leave you to the wolves. Peter leaves Jesus to the wolves in his faithlessness, but Jesus doesn't leave us to the wolves. In fact, what he does is he goes out to meet the wolves and to be torn apart for our sake and our protection. And so it continues now to the further denials. It says it was cold, they were standing, they were warming themselves. And Peter was also with them. He's in a weird situation now where he's in enemy territory and he's just sort of about there and probably wondering what exactly to do with himself, but thinking that perhaps if he pulls away that would look strange now. So he's going to have to sort of stay around there. And it seems like a strange sort of detail for John to fixate on. He gives all the detail about a charcoal fire and all of this sort of thing. Part of it is to show you this is all happening really late at night. What that means is, this is a miscarriage of justice. Trials were not supposed to be happening at night. They should be happening in the day. It's a way, and it's something even today that we would have, that actually you've got to have a fair trial. People have to have a fair hearing. And this is one of the ways in which you make it very much unfair. So that's a part of what John's doing. But the other part is to set up him returning to this scene. He sort of gives so much detail here to paint a picture for us, because he's going to return straight back to it in just a second. In verse 25, he'll come back to the very same scene, using almost identical language. That Peter is here standing and warming himself by the charcoal fire here. And the idea is that time hasn't passed. Between John talking about the first denial here and the second and third denial, time hasn't passed. He's just come from one scene, cut, and then back into the scene again. And so Peter's asked the same question. You also are not one of his disciples, are you? It's another opportunity for Peter maybe actually to come clean here and say, well, yeah, actually I was. He responds, I'm not. And then one of the servants of the high priest, verse 26, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, his kind of thoughtless action is coming back to bite him now, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? He's been seen. It's rumbled that he was there. He is a disciple. Now will he continue to go with the story, even though it's starting to look a bit ridiculous now? Because people kind of know. Yeah, you were. And yet he still sticks to the story. It says, verse 27, Peter again denied it. And at once a rooster crowed, just as Jesus had promised earlier in chapter 13. Peter chooses comfort above Christ. And this is the source of our temptation. So where are we tempted to choose comfort above Christ? And where it comes to a straight shootout between, well, if we continue to affirm Jesus here in this situation, before this person, things could get difficult. Things could get hard. Where are we tempted, actually, to give in to comfort over Christ? Peter sacrifices his friend to avoid suffering, while Jesus does all to protect his friends. Jesus is faithful and loyal to you too. Peter's given this difficult choice between, there's an interesting book that was written in 1970 by Albert Hirschman called Exit, Voice and Loyalty. Initially it was written about consumers with products and brands that they buy from and they keep going to. And the idea is, what happens when standards in those start to drop? And the idea is that you have the two choices between exit and voice. You have the option to either just simply exit, you stop buying from there, you stop going to that shop, you end the relationship. Or to voice. That is, you probably stick around with the brand, with the shop, with the person, but you kind of voice that, look, some things are not right here, standards are slipping, I'd love this to improve if you want to keep my custom. And actually it's a book that's gone on to be used in many more fields than just retail, to talk about all sorts of things, including sort of political activism and things. Peter's left with this choice. Does he exit or does he voice? And the key to it, and the title there was Exit, Voice and Loyalty, is loyalty. That loyalty will shape, in large part, what you will do. So if you're more loyal to a brand or to a person, you are more likely not to exit, but to voice. You're more likely to say, no, I love you enough to tell you what you're not going to like to hear initially, but I'm going to stick with you. Or you're more likely to endure hardship in order to stay with that person. You might be more likely to endure criticism from others because you've held to that person. Peter's choice here reveals that actually his loyalty is much, much lower than he has said. He said, even though everybody else might leave you, I won't, even to the very end. This has revealed that that wasn't true. Whether he realised that or not, it wasn't true. The loyalty was such that actually he took the choice of exiting and not voicing. That actually he was his disciple, and even though that may have caused hardship, and there's the painful and challenging reality of the situation Peter's put into, and yet the hope is that actually Jesus is loyal to us and faithful to us even where we are not. There's firstly the miscarriage of justice. Secondly, there's the denial of a friend. And thirdly, there's this plot line of speaking truth to power. Before the religious leaders here, it says the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. It's an illegitimate trial. They don't have any evidence. They're seeking for it during the trial, which is something that nowadays we would not accept and not allow to happen, because we recognise that that's wrong legally, that someone shouldn't be forced to implicate themselves with a confession there, that actually you have to find evidence first and then question them beyond it. Jesus responds, I've spoken openly. I haven't hidden anything. I haven't got a hidden teaching and a public teaching. It's all the same. I've spoken openly. I've spoken in the synagogues. I've spoken in the temple. I've spoken in the marketplace. I've spoken where everybody can hear me. You know what I've taught. In fact, you then say, ask those who've heard. And we know from John's account that actually some within the religious leaders actually have heard Jesus' teaching and have come round to it. Nicodemus is one of them, but he's not the only one. Why don't you ask them? And Jesus isn't just being disrespectful here. It's important to see he's not just being disrespectful. What he's doing is highlighting the illegitimacy of the legal process that they're following here. He's saying, you have nothing. If you want to know about my teaching, you already know. It's already out there in the public domain. You don't need to now interrogate me here to find it. He's then struck. He says, well, look, if I've said or done anything wrong, well, then why wouldn't you just actually tell me what it is I've done? He highlights the fact that actually he's not being given a proper trial here, that there's a corruption about the religious leaders here, that they've already made the verdict, they've already cast the sentence, they want him dead, they have for a long time, and they're going to make sure that happens no matter what. And then he's dragged before Pilate. We know that that's because they're seeking the verdict and the sentence of crucifixion. And so Pilate is seeking to find out what's actually wrong. We've heard before, he said, well, what has he actually done? He's now begins to question Jesus, says verse 33 here, are you the king of the Jews? It tells you, here's the emphasis for Pilate and for the Roman Empire from their perspective is power. Well, are you a king then? What's your deal? What are you after? What are you trying to do? Might you threaten our thing that we have going on here? And so Jesus does a bit of a Louis Theroux here. One of the great things about his documentaries is he does this thing where he asks what seems like a really naive question. It's really sort of too simple. And he kind of portrays himself like he's like that. But actually he's not. He's really asking the very most fundamental question here. And Jesus does something very similar. Look at him respond. He says, do you say this of your own accord? Are these your words? Or actually, are you just parroting what others have said? Why are you really asking me this? He knows it's not Pilate's question. And so Pilate pushes further again, verse 35. What have you done? And Jesus gives this sort of fairly enigmatic response, really, which is more a response to the question, what kind of king are you, than what have you done? He hasn't done anything wrong. He's more answering the question, what kind of a king are you? And what he does is, the technical term for it is a chiasm. It's where you make one statement here, and then a second statement, and then your closing statement kind of mirrors the first one. So he has two crucial truths here, at the beginning and at the end, where he says, my kingdom is not of this world. And he finishes by saying, but my kingdom is not from the world. And it highlights the bit in the middle. Here's the two crucial truths, which are highlighting the central conundrum for Pilate. And Jesus is turning the question back on Pilate to say, well, no, here's the question that actually you have to answer now, is he says, verse 36, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. So what kind of a king am I? And where does my kingdom come from? There's the question before Pilate. Jesus turns it full circle and speaks truth to Pilate and says, no, the thing that you have to now decide is what kind of a kingdom is this? What kind of a king am I? And what will you do about it? And it's come full circle. Jesus' life has begun with Herod, a king not understanding Jesus' kingdom, and so has sought to kill him, and has killed the infants in his area. And his life is ending with a king or ruler not understanding his kingdom, and so being willing to convict him, despite his innocence, in order to maintain his power. He says, verse 37 here, Jesus, I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth. He's not on trial here. He's been on trial all his life. And what he's been doing is bearing witness to the truth. He's been presenting the glory of God, John has told us earlier on in the gospel. But he's also been presenting the truth about God, about humanity, about the world. And so he says, verse 37, everyone who's of the truth listens. And the question is, will Pilate? And his answer is sad. It's the answer of postmodernity. What is truth? I've come to bear witness to the truth. Everybody who listens to me is of the truth. What is truth? He knows he's innocent. He knows he's committed no crime. But he has no real concept of exactly who Jesus is, and he refuses really to engage with it for the sake of this might cost me my power, this might disrupt my kingdom here, so I can't possibly submit to the kingdom of the whole world and of eternity, Jesus. And so Jesus is put out to the crowd. Pilate attempts to find a way to make it clear that it's not him who's consigned him to death, it's the crowd. He offers them Barabbas or Jesus, and the crowd who have lauded Jesus and followed him and celebrated him now turn upon him and ask that he be crucified. He gives up his convictions to maintain order and therefore his sense of power. John's account here is creative. He's flipping back and forward from these three plot lines: a miscarriage of justice, denial of a friend, and speaking truth to power. And there's this contrast between Jesus' trial and Peter's denial. Peter's faithlessness and Jesus' faithfulness. The account is unemotional. It's pretty factual. It doesn't really give you too much of how anyone's feeling at all, really, here. It's a witness statement. It's as if John himself is in the dock here, giving a statement, an assessment of what Jesus has done and who he is. It's as if he's testifying in court. And John's account, finally, asks you to come to a verdict. And we know that this is John's intent by flipping forward just a little bit to chapter 20, verse 30 and 31. It says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book. Here's his purpose. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. He's asking you for a verdict. Just as actually, although Jesus is being put on trial, he's turning it back round and asking the questions of those questioning him, especially Pilate. This account is questioning you. What will you do? It asks you to come to a verdict. Firstly, will you believe and trust in Jesus, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the supreme power of the world? And number two, will you hold to his name? Or will you, when under pressure, deny him? John asks you to come to a verdict. Will you trust him? Will you believe him? And will you hold to his name? Let me pray for us and we'll close up. Father God, I thank you for your grace, your mercy and your love, your kindness to us. I thank you that you came to live as one of us and to die for us in our place as a perfect offering for sin, that you might cleanse us from sin and you might give us your righteousness, that we might avoid your judgment, Lord, and that we might be made right with you. And Jesus, I thank you that you are faithful even when I am faithless. The Lord, you stepped into suffering. You didn't avoid it. You didn't step back from it. You stepped into it that you might save us. Help us, Lord, I pray, when we are tempted to step back from suffering for your name and to instead step into it and trust your faithfulness for us. We thank you and we pray for your help. In Jesus' name, amen.